Hi, Kevin Green here. Welcome to Pathways to the Past. Today I'm going to talk to you about my favorite subject, which is local railroad history. I've talked about the history of the North-South line through Seymour. I've talked about the history of the East-West line through Seymour. But at one time there was a third large railroad that came to Seymour. Most people that have been around for a while will remember it as the Milwaukee Road. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that line, and especially as it pertains to Seymour and Jackson County. So let's get started. From the middle to the late 1800s, there were railroads being built all across the United States. And it's hard to imagine how much it meant for a town to get a railroad to come to their location. It meant efficient way to get goods into the town, as well as local factories and industries to be able to get their goods distributed all across the United States. And also the passengers that would come through town was a steady stream of customers for the local businesses, the hotels and restaurants particularly. So there were hundreds, if not thousands, of railroads planned to connect from town to town, mostly financed by local town businessmen. But unfortunately, most of them, if they were built, it was hard to maintain enough business to be profitable and succeed. So I would say most of them failed if they were built at all. Now in southwestern Indiana, and here comes Jezebel to meow, so you might hear her. There was a fellow named DJ Mackey, and he has succeeded in building a couple of lines that were profitable. Come on, come up here. One of them was the Evansville and Terre Haute Railroad. The other one was the Evansville and Indianapolis. But he had the idea to build a line across southern Indiana to connect Evansville to Richmond, Indiana. Richmond being on the east side, center of the state. It was a thriving community at the time, but they were only being served by one railroad, that being to Pennsylvania. So DJ Mackey wanted to build this line across southern Indiana that he could tap into the business at either end, as well as tap into the coal fields that were operating in southwestern Indiana. And also he could pick up business from the limestone companies around Bedford. So in the 1880s, he planned to build this line. Now he had this line already operating from Evansville up to Indianapolis, which passed through a little town called Elnora, E-L-N-O-R-A, Elnora. And so he knew that he could build from there going east, and then through the line he owned, he could connect into Evansville then. So the plans was to build from Elnora across southern Indiana and up to Richmond. So that was in summer of 1888. He had most of the lines surveyed, and the newspapers nicknamed it the Mackey Road. It was the Evansville and Richmond Railroad. By November of 1888, most of the right-of-way had been acquired. They would have to decide where the line would go and then negotiate with the landowners and buy property from them as they went. It was estimated at that time that the cost to build the line would be about $9,000 per mile, which was a huge amount of money at the time. And by July of 1890, the line was in operation. Well, some of it was. By the fall of 1890, the entire line, 175 miles, I'm sorry, that's not right. 175 miles would have been if it made it to Richmond, but it didn't make it to Richmond. Getting ahead of myself a little bit, but by the fall of 1890, it was built from Elnora through Jackson County, so it went to Norman, it went through Kurtz, Freetown, Surprise, Cortland, through Seymour, and then over to up through Reddington, and then made it eventually to Westport. And at Westport, it was able to connect in and do business with the Big Four Railroad, which went through Westport as well. But that was the end of the line at that time. The locomotives and rolling stock that they used at that time were owned actually from the Evansville and Terre Haute Railroad that he also owned, so they borrowed their locomotives and rolling stock at that time. Now in 1890, when they made it through Seymour, downtown Seymour was well established at this point. That's where the other two railroads crossed. So it was impossible for him to build through the middle of the already established town, so he built along the north edge of the town. So the line came into town. Today it would be between 8th and 9th Street, across Chestnut Street, across the Pennsylvania line, and was able to do business with them there. They went up past Shields Park and then curved out of Seymour to the northeast, headed up toward Reddington. So they built a passenger station where across Chestnut Street. I suppose they picked Chestnut Street because it was a direct street, a nice direct street straight to the downtown business district, about 7 blocks in to get to the business district. So the original small passenger station was located where across Chestnut Street it would have been on the north side of the railroad tracks and then on the east side of Chestnut. And they also built a very small freight house which stood on the west side of Chestnut Street at that time. I have a picture of that station here I'll show. Now the competition amongst the different railroads for business was pretty fierce and could get pretty cutthroat. The Pennsylvania didn't want the Evansville and Richmond Railroad to make it to Richmond because they were the sole railroad going through Richmond at the time. So they threatened the ENR and told them if they continued to build from Westport over to Richmond, that the Pennsylvania would build into Evansville and be a better, more efficient route to get it to Evansville and would take business away from them. So Mackey seems to have given up at that point on the idea of making it to Richmond, and it terminated at Westport then. In March the 6th in 1897, as can happen in Jackson County during the springtime, there was a torrential rain for several days and storms which flooded, pretty severe flood, and it washed out at least 10 trestles between Bedford and Westport, especially between Bedford and Seymour. On the west side of Seymour, there were 64 miles of track that was made useless, so basically only allowed them to go to Bedford at that point. That led to financial difficulties, which the railroad was never really acquired a lot of business because of not making it to Richmond. They just went to Westport, which didn't generate a whole bunch of business. So in March of 26, 1897, the company, having financial problems, was purchased by the bondholders for $1.4 million. It was reorganized as the Evansville and Richmond Railway Company at that time. In August of 1897, it was advertised in the Seymour newspapers that the company was looking for at least 20 men to be hired from Seymour to begin rebuilding the Evansville and Richmond, and they would be paying wages of $1.50 per day. Then in October of 1897, the line was purchased from the bondholders by a fellow named John R. Walsh. He was a multimillionaire from Chicago, owned several banks, including the Chicago National Bank, and numerous other businesses and industries numerous to mention at this time. So Mr. Walsh had renamed the line the Southern Indiana Railway Company, and he had huge plans for his newly acquired railroad, including going ahead with the extension into Richmond, and as well as wanting to build extensions into Illinois and north to Chicago. He understood the importance of business into Chicago would be for the railroad. By January 1898, the entire line was rebuilt, or at least from Bedford to Westport was repaired and reopened, back in business from Elnora to Westport. Now, Mr. Welsh understood what it would mean to be able to do business with the commercial district in downtown Seymour. So he started coming up with ways that he could get his railroad into downtown. So amongst the plans that he had, the first big plan that he seems to have had was to build a line along the west side of the current Pennsylvania Railroad, from where they connected with them or crossed with them up in the north part of Seymour, down to next to the B&O line, and then run along the north side of the B&O line. And he planned on building a new passenger station and freight station in the downtown area so that he could exchange freight and passengers with the other lines in town, as well as allowing the passengers to do business with them. And just about as wiggling the table. Settle down. He also seemed to have had in mind bringing tracks down the middle of O'Brien Street, which was the eastern city limits at the time for Seymour, from his tracks down to the B&O line, and then he could connect back in along the north side of the B&O tracks to the line that followed the Pennsylvania back up to where his tracks were. So let's go downtown and I'll show you where Cincinnati Avenue would have been. Okay, here we go. So in downtown Seymour, at the crossing of the north, south, east, west railroad tracks right there. And going north from there, you've got Indianapolis Avenue with buildings on either side. Going to the west, you've got St. Louis Avenue. Going south is Jeffersonville Avenue. But from early days of Seymour until about 1900, now on the south side of the tracks, east of the north-south line, that was all railroad property, which I've talked about in other videos. O&M, then B&O Railroad, they had their roundhouses and shops and yards and stuff like that there. But on the north side of the east-west tracks, there would have been a street that followed right along the railroad tracks over here called Cincinnati Avenue. And then from Indianapolis Avenue east to Ewing Street, there were commercial buildings facing the tracks. I think there were about 6 buildings in the layout that I looked at. And then from Ewing to Broadway, there were more commercial buildings. Commercial buildings that would have been restaurants, hotels, there's a couple hotels, saloons, a billiard room, things that people getting off of the train tracks or the trains at the stations would have been able to utilize. The B&O station was right across on the other side of the tracks here. Cincinnati Avenue continued on down to O'Brien Street, and once you got east of Broadway, then it was commercial residences along facing the tracks. So Mr. Walsh, when he wanted to get his Southern Indiana Railroad into the downtown area to be able to exchange passengers and freight with the other railroads that were down here, he basically bought up Cincinnati Avenue half a block north to the alley that ran behind the buildings and houses, all the way from here all the way down to O'Brien Street. He purchased the properties. He had to negotiate with each individual property owner in order to get these properties, in order to put his right-of-way in for his Southern Indiana Railroad and get his stations built down here. So Walsh goes before the Seymour City Council with proposals on what he wants to do, and he will be dumping a whole bunch of money into the city to get this to happen. And in May of 1899, the Seymour City Council actually grants him the rights to build his line, his two stations downtown, and the line along the west side of the Pennsylvania tracks. But at that time, they didn't give him the okay for O'Brien Street. But there was actually rumors at the time that the Big Four Railroad going through Westport, they had not built their bridge across the Ohio River yet into Louisville. So they were wanting to make a deal with either the Pennsylvania at Seymour or the Monon over at Bedford to use the Southern Indiana tracks and then one of the other lines south to get into Louisville, and that would generate a lot of extra rail traffic and revenue as well for the area. It was in July of 1899 that he went back before the Seymour City Council and was granted the rights to build his tracks down O'Brien Street. So at this point, he has purchased most of the properties along Cincinnati, well, all the properties along Cincinnati Avenue, and some of them that he had to buy or give compensation for around O'Brien Street and this areas on the southeast side or northeast side of Seymour. And it's estimated that it could have been as much as $200,000 up to maybe $300,000 that he spent in this area buying up properties and building his new stations and all that sort of thing. So he was dumping a ton of money into his railroad just in Seymour alone. Now, if you look at a 1900 atlas of Jackson County, the map, especially of Seymour, shows the proposed route coming down O'Brien Street along the north side of the B&O and up the west side of the Pennsylvania. But of course, the line next to the Pennsylvania was never built. I imagine the Pennsylvania was not very happy about having to give up some of the space in order for their competitor to run lines down into the downtown Seymour area, especially because Walsh renewed the idea of building into Richmond and was adamant about that. So the tracks along the west side of the Pennsylvania were never put in. However, all through 1900, 1901, right-of-way was acquired and graded, and they ran the line down O'Brien Street to the B&O and along the north side of the B&O tracks. And he started building a new passenger station and freight station in the downtown Seymour area. He also built a small yard on the northeast side of Seymour. It's about 4 tracks wide with the water tanks and that sort of thing there. The stations that he built, were ready to be used. They opened on January the 26th, 1902, both as brand new Southern Indiana Railroad passenger and freight stations were open for business. And one of those buildings that still stands, so let's go down and take a look at that. And here I am at the Jackson County Visitor Center off of Broadway here, which is housed in this restored train station, which is the only train station left standing in Seymour. This station was built by John Walsh for his new and improved Southern Indiana Railroad. This was the freight depot, which would have served the line. The Southern Indiana Railroad right-of-way, where let's see, would be standing on it basically right here, had one track which came west from O'Brien Street down through here. You can see ties in the ground still over here, but that would have been the B&O. The 1907 Sanborn map actually shows 8 tracks of the B&O at this location going to the south. Then the Southern Indiana right-of-way would have went across Broadway here, and the passenger station sat basically in the center of the next block down, where the building is located across here. That was tore down in 1938 to make way for that building, which was at the time the J.C. Grubb warehouses. The loading unloading platform would have came out over these stone pillars here right up next to the tracks, which would have been right where we're walking. You can see ties in the ground over here from the where the B&O was. So there you have it. That's John Walsh's Southern Indiana Freight Depot, built here in Seymour. It was opened in late January of 1902. This was one of many stations that he built along his route to improve the overall operation of the route. An interesting side note with the whole Cincinnati Avenue being purchased scenario is that one of the supporters of the Southern Indiana Railroad was a fellow named John Herschel Peter, which I've talked about in the development of the Boulevards area. He owned all the land over here up to about Pine Street, and was at this time, while the railroad was coming into town, was laying out lots and developing the properties between 6th and 2nd Street, and then from Pine Street down to about Elm Street. So the buildings that were bought along Cincinnati Avenue, especially the smaller residences, were auctioned off, and John Herschel Peter purchased most of those, and he had those houses moved to lots that he was developing along 2nd Street and 4th Street. It said that at least 18 homes were moved from Cincinnati Avenue down to along 2nd Street and over along 4th Street. So it's interesting to know today that some of the houses that you see standing from Pine to Elm Street on 2nd and 4th Street were originally standing on Cincinnati Avenue. That's pretty cool. So some other dates to note. In September of 1900, the line was extended into Terre Haute, and by October of 1904, the entire line had been rebuilt, because when Mackey built it, he used cheap materials, and it was deteriorating at that point, and so the entire line was new rails and ties and everything were all put in. 1905, the line reached the Illinois state line. Also in 1905, he built at least 4 roundhouses to service the locomotives. One was built at Seymour. It was at the yards that he had over on the northeast side of town. It was a brick roundhouse with 4 stalls, and it was situated on the north side of the small yard that was there, which would be south of 10th Street today, in that kind of open area right there. There's some houses that have been built in that part of town. There's also a roundhouse built at Latta, and larger ones built at Bedford and Terre Haute. So things seem to be going along pretty well for Mr. Walsh. He was dumping tons of money into lots of different things, probably a little too quickly, building hotels, buying coal mines, extending railroads all over the place. But in December 18, 1905, Walsh's Chicago National Bank fails. In March of 1906, Walsh himself is arrested for misuse of banking funds because of that failure. In the meantime, the line is still being built, and in October of 1907, via the Chicago Southern Railway, the Southern Indiana line reaches Chicago. So we have opened 342 miles from Chicago through Terre Haute, Bedford, Seymour, over to Westport. In November of 1907, Walsh is put on trial for the misuse of his bank funds. In January of 1908, Walsh, who was 70 years old at the time, is found guilty on 54 counts of misuse of funds, and he's sentenced to 5 years in prison, which leads to financial difficulties for the Southern Indiana Railroad. In August of that year, it goes into receivership. There were several different companies, including the U.S. Steel Company and other railroads, that were expressed interest in purchasing the line. By 1910, Walsh is reported to be in declining health. November of 1910, the Southern Indiana Railroad is sold to stockholders for $1.3 million. At that time, the line is renamed the Chicago, Terre Haute, and Southeastern Railroad, and they're mainly interested in the Chicago down to Terre Haute to Bedford line. That seems to be the profitable part of the line. In October of 1911, because of declining health reasons, Walsh is paroled from prison, released, and less than 2 weeks later he was dead from heart disease. So that ends Mr. Walsh's story. We go then to May of 1921. There's a railroad called the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway. They were having trouble at the time acquiring coal to run their locomotives. So they were interested in this line coming out of Chicago down into southwestern Indiana, and the coal fields that they serviced down there, and they thought that'd be a great source for coal. So they leased the line for 999 years, effective July the 1st of 1921. Then in March of 1927, a railroad was organized called the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railway, better known as the Milwaukee Road. So it comes into existence, and going to the next page, my timeline, on January the 1st, or January the 13th, 1928, the Milwaukee Road takes possession of the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul Railway. So that at that point, the line through Seymour is now officially the Milwaukee Road. See, and I don't claim to be an expert on Milwaukee Railroad history, but they never seem to have been a particularly profitable company, and they seem to be having financial difficulties often. The first being in June of 1935, they filed for bankruptcy. As far as the Seymour history goes, in August of 1938, the J.C. Grubb Company, which is a wholesale grocery distributing company, still in existence today, they had warehouses in downtown Seymour, but were always needing more space. So they purchased from the Milwaukee Road the properties that belonged to them that housed the Milwaukee Road passenger station, which doesn't seem to be getting much use at this point. They tore down the station and built their big new state-of-the-art warehouse between Broadway and Ewing Street on the north side of the tracks, which is, most people today will remember that being the Hoosier Parts warehouse building. It's still standing today. So that's the ending of the Milwaukee Road passenger station in Seymour in 1938 when it was tore down. Let's see, the December 1945, Milwaukee Road emerges from bankruptcy for the first time. Next thing on my list is November 28th, 1960. Because of declining business, the railroad is granted permission to discontinue what they call the Westport branch, which was the Seymour to Westport part of the railroad. That would be effective January the 3rd, 1961. The Indiana Railway Museum purchased a few miles of the track over at Westport for excursions, and they used it for a while. And that leads us to 1977. In November of 1977, the railroad not doing well financially, and there was a derailment about a mile west of Freetown on the line. A rail broke under the second locomotive, putting it on the ground and piling up about 9 freight cars. And that was the last time that traffic ran Bedford to Seymour on the Milwaukee Road. It was shut down after that. Exactly 1 month later, in December, the Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy for the third time in 42 years. And through a series of sellouts and selling properties, by 1986, the Milwaukee Road had basically become no more. So that's my history of the Milwaukee Road, especially as it pertains to Jackson County and Seymour. As a teenage railroad fanatic, riding his bike around Seymour back in the mid to late 70s, the Milwaukee was my favorite line because I got to know those guys that came to Seymour pretty well enough that I did some work for them along the line as a teenager, believe it or not, and even got to ride the caboose to Bedford with them. But that's probably a story for another time. Also, maybe this summer when the weather's nice, I'd like to make a video showing the route as best as I can remember as it passed through the city of Seymour, and we'll look and see if there's any kind of remnants of the line still in existence today. So that's this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you would, please. Thanks, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.